So we'll talk more about some specific examples in a minute, but I want to hit these, particularly that last one, because for those of you who don't live in an environment like the U.S. where this is even possible, I can see how you'd wonder to yourself, why would anyone ever want to do this? And I can tell you, I've seen time after time after time, sellers go, you know what? That would actually be beneficial for me. That actually would be better for me to do it that way than to take the gain up front, get slaughtered in taxes. And then here's the next question. Let's say you take that $1 million in cash, and say the seller takes it all in cash at closing. They get $1 million. Uncle Sam takes, let's say, 20%. So they got $800,000 left. Okay, great. Now what? Where do you put it? It's got to last you for the next 20, 30 years of your life. Do you put it in the stock market? Really? In 2024? At 7 years old? Probably not. Do you put it in Bitcoin? Probably not. Do you put it in something safe? Well, what's safe? CD? Okay, so maybe now you're getting 2%, or maybe 2.5%, maybe 3% if you do a long-term CD. And that's not horrible, but what if I said to you, instead of putting it into a 2% or a 3% or even 4% CD, what if I paid you 5%? And you financed it with me on an asset that you already know and love because it was yours a few minutes ago. And if we're doing this in a state like Georgia or Texas, where it's a fast foreclosed state, if I don't perform, you get to keep my down payment and take the property back inexpensively. And in Georgia, you can do this in about a month. Same thing about Texas, about a month. So you can get your property back, keep my down payment, and if you wanted to, sell it to somebody else a month later and make even more money than if I paid you on time. So the risk to the seller is minimal. In fact, there's effectively no risk to the seller. How does that sound to you, Mr. Seller? Most people are going to go, that sounds pretty darn good to me. I get cash flow, which is what I wanted in the first place as a landlord. I get it secured by an asset that I've known for the last 20 years. It was mine before I sold it to you. And if you don't act right, I'm going to take my property back. Because that seller is no longer a landlord. That seller is now a lender. And if I don't perform, they're not going to evict me. They're going to foreclose on me, which in Georgia, for example, is very swift. So there are tons and tons of reasons why, as a seller, this approach makes sense. It's in many ways a better investment strategy than taking the cash and then scratching your head and sticking it under a mattress or sticking it in an underperforming investment. And so it is in many ways a fairly easy pitch to make. We did 4 deals with the same seller in Tulsa last year. The first 2 deals we did, we tried to get her to consider seller finance. She didn't want to do it. She wanted cash. So we did the first 2 deals cash. The third deal we did, she said, okay, let me try the seller finance thing. And she loved it. And then from then on, she said, I only want to do seller finance deals. So we've done so far 4 deals with her. 2 were cash. These last 2 were seller financing, and everything else that we can do with her seller finance, we're going to do it because she doesn't need the cash. She's not trying to buy more real estate. She wants the cash flow. It is way more straightforward than the banks would have you believe. They'd want you to think it's complicated and scary and involves lots of stuff, but that's not so. So let's talk about a case study. I'm looking at a deal right now in Marietta, Georgia. These numbers are approximate, and I, in some cases, had to modify them so that the example would work. But let's take a look at a cash scenario. So these prices are more like 2023 prices. $300,000 ARV, $290,000 purchase price. No down payment because I'm going to buy it all in cash. The rent is about $2,800. I think this is a 4-bedroom. Annual expenses are about $14,000. It doesn't need any work or very little work. So I put $5,000 for closing costs and renovation. No interest rate because, again, we're paying cash. No debt service because it's cash. No loan fees because it's cash. Hopefully I got these numbers right. Cash flow is going to be $34,000. Let's check my numbers. That should be 2,800 times 12. Yep. Well, 33.6. I had to round it up because I couldn't fit it online. So 34,000-ish. The operating expenses are 14,000. So my cash flow is in this case going to be about $20,000, right? And again, for here, just like before, let's assume that in year one, my CapEx is included in my rehab budget. So I'm taking care of all my capital expenses as part of the rehab budget. So I don't have to take that into account in my cash flow. So in a cash transaction like this, my cash and cash return is the $20,000 cash flow divided by my all-in. My all-in is the $290 I paid cash plus the $5,000 in closing costs and renovation budget, or $295. So if you divide 20K by 295, you should get, like I did, 6.7%. Not a slam dunk deal, but not a horrible deal. Doable. I think we'd all agree that's not the worst deal that you're probably seeing today. Contrast that to the same deal, except with a bank loan. And I'll tell you up front that I had to work this example hard to make this thing even cash flow. I started out with actual interest rates of 8%, and I couldn't do it at 8%. At 8%, it's negative cash flow. So same 290 price. Let's assume a 20% down payment, which is pretty standard for a bank loan. So 58,000 down, the same $2,800 in rent, the same 14,000 in expenses, and the same closing costs and rehab, 5,000. I'm assuming a 7% interest rate. I'm assuming a 30-year amortization, so $1,544 a month, and I'm assuming $2,000 in loan fees. That's going to be things like appraisal and application fee and any other junk fees that the bank's going to throw in there. It's on the low side, but let's just put something in there. $2,000. Now my cash flow is the 35,000 minus the 14,000 in expenses like I had before, but now I have debt service, right? Because I'm paying $1,544 a month, which works out to be around 18,500 in debt. So I barely squeak out a cash flow of $1,500. That's annual. That's not like monthly. That's an annual cash flow. That's pretty pitiful because, well, it's pretty pitiful. So my cash and cash return is that pitiful $1,500 in cash flow divided by my all-in. My all-in this case is the 58,000 down plus the 2,000 in loan fees plus the 5,000 in closing costs and rehab. That looks to me like 65. So if you divide 1,500 by 65,000, you get 2.3%. And again, I was being kind. Prevailing rates right now are more like 7 and change, nearly 8. But at 8%, it doesn't even cash flow. At 8%, you can't. I get a zero. I get a negative cash flow. So just for the purposes of this example, you can see why a bank loan on a deal like this doesn't even make it work. You can't even do the deal with the bank loan. So investors who are only looking to go out and get a loan, they can get a loan, will look at this deal and go, oh, this doesn't work. I can't make it cash flow. And too bad for them, because we, instead of offering this person all cash, are going to make a seller financed offer. Well, actually, we're going to make them both. We're going to make them a cash offer, but not for $290, for less than $290. And we're going to make them a seller financed offer for their full asking price, because we're going to offer $290 asking, but we're only going to offer $20,000 down. So yeah, you get your $290, but I'm only going to pay you $20,000 at closing, a little under 10%. Same monthly rent, same annual expenses, same cash, same closing costs and rehab. But I'm going to negotiate a lower interest rate, and it's going to be interest only. And at 5.6%, it ends up being about $1,260 a month, which is obviously less than the $1,544 for the bank loan example. And there are no loan fees, right? I'm not paying for an appraisal. I'm not paying for the junk fees. And so now my cash flow is at 34,000 minus the 14,000. But instead of 18.5 in debt service, it's only 15,000 in debt service, which means I get to squeeze out a cash flow of $5,000, which is like 3 times better. But it doesn't end there. My cash flow is $5,000, but my all-in cash investment is not 58 plus 2 plus 5. I'm only paying 2,000 down, and then I got 5,000 in closing costs and rehab, so I'm 25,000 in all investment. So 5,000 divided by 25 gives me a $20,000 cash and cash return. I know I went through that kind of fast, but are you guys all with me still? You see how a deal that kind of limps along cash, doesn't work at all with a bank loan, gives you eye-popping cash and cash return with the seller finance offer. Now, maybe the seller's not, this is my offer, right? I'm not saying they're going to accept this. I'm saying if they accepted this, my cash and cash return would be 20%. But I could play around with this. If I had to pay them a little bit more down, I could pay them a little bit more down because I got a lot of room to negotiate here. If I had to go up to $30,000 or $40,000 down, I could probably still do it. And again, if this seller doesn't need that cash and this seller doesn't need a whole lot more than 20,000, then we can make this deal work. And if we can make this deal work, while normal investors are looking at this deal going, can't make it work, I'm looking at this deal going, give me 10 of these, please. So I'm going to pause and ask if anybody has any questions or if I have put you all to sleep. I put you all to sleep. Yeah, still there?
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. I have a question, Mitch, and I'm
Sure. Yeah. In fact, this is Q&A. So, yep.
Awesome. I'm curious about, how do you wrap up the deal? Like, let's say that you do a seller finance and then you want to sell the property, or you want to refinance. So you are basically repaying the seller the full amount, or how do you close that into the details of the deal?
Yeah. So in this case, the seller will get let's use this as an example. In this case, the purchase price was $200. The down payment is $20. So the seller actually is going to have a $270,000 lien on the property. It'll show up just like as if it were a bank loan. It'll be a cloud on the title. There'll be a note. There'll be a security deed or mortgage, depending on what state you're in. So it'll behave just like any other loan. And if I wanted to refinance this down the road, although just for the record, I would never want to refinance this, right? I mean, I might want to sell it, although I want to even do that, but I would never want to refinance this because I can't beat this rate, like ever, at least not going forward. Maybe 5 years ago I could have beaten it, but right now I can't beat this rate. But let's say down the road I want to pay this thing off. I'd have to go to the seller and they'd have to give me a payoff, just like any other lender, and it would be whatever I'd help them calculate it, but it'd be whatever the payments that I made, whatever principal payments I made, if any, to reduce the balance, and they would issue that to the closing attorney for the refi or for the sale, and just like any other closing, they would bring that payoff to the closing attorney or title company. At closing, they would issue them a payment, and the new lender or the new buyer would come in and bring their financing to put on the house. So it behaves no differently than any other kind of financing. It's still a note. It's still a mortgage. It's the same thing that you would do if it were Wells Fargo or Chase Bank. It behaves exactly the same. In this case, just for the record, I would also typically want to, just like Chase or Wells Fargo, I would want to have an insurance policy to protect this lender, because the person who's selling me this house wants to make sure that I make these payments. And if for some reason the house burns down before I make the payments, they want to be protected just like Wells Fargo wants to be protected. So there are some housekeeping things that I need to make sure are in place to protect them, but they'd be the same things that you would have in place for any other lender that you'd have on your property. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Thank you.
Sure. There are companies that will handle if, for example, the seller didn't want to deal with me any longer, they wanted to have a processor. There are private loan processors that will handle all the math and all of the logistics so that I can make payments to that that intermediary, and then when I did need to get a payoff, that intermediary could calculate how much I owed still, and then they could issue the payoff statement to the closing attorney. But it's not a huge burden, and honestly, I'm going to know exactly to the penny how much the balance is, and so if they get it wrong, I'm going to correct them, and if they get it right, then we're cool. But the paperwork behaves identically to if a bank were on the other side of the transaction. The only difference is that all those fees that we're so accustomed to paying to banks don't have to be paid, and that in many cases the seller is far happier to do a transaction like this than to get the lump sum of cash. Any other questions about anything that I've talked about here? Does this make sense? Do people get why this is a big deal? With interest rates. Oh, sorry, somebody had a question?
No, Mitch, I was just saying for myself, just taking it all in, my friend, I've told you before that seller financing is something that I've always wanted to improve on. So I can tell you that my silence is more or less just absorbing a lot of this. That's all. But it's been great with you placing these three scenarios side by side, because I think to myself, who wouldn't want to do seller financing, to be honest with you?
Yeah. Generally speaking, I'll say that the only people who don't want to do seller financing are folks who are still actively in the business, as far as investors are concerned, are either, there's two categories. One is investors who are still actively in acquisition mode and they need their cash from this sale to go into their next sale. Or let's say they're doing a 1031 exchange where they can't finance it. They need to use all their equity to move to the next investment to avoid taxes. Or they're owner occupants who need cash to go buy their next house. But honestly, those aren't the people that we're trying to talk to. We're talking to a lot of people who are seniors, a lot of tired landlords, and I will say, just as an aside, that the tired landlord community, and by tired landlord I mean people who have rental property whose tenants aren't paying them, so they have filed an eviction notice in their local county that John Smith, my tenant, hasn't paid me in 6, 7, 8 months, and I want them out, and I want my property back. Well, if I can get that notice and reach that seller, I can be their new best friend. Hey, Mr. Jones, I see that your tenant owes you $8,000 that you're probably never going to see, and probably has done damage to your house, and you're probably not loving being a landlord right now. What if I take this problem off your plate? You never have to talk to that tenant again, and I can buy this property from you. Would that be something that you'd want to talk to me about? And usually the answer is, tell me more. And these landlords, many of them who've been in the business for 20, 30 years, they own property that's free and clear. And while it's not true that you can't do this with property that's not free and clear, it is true that it's a whole lot simpler when the property is free and clear. And if it's free and clear, that means that there's going to be typically a significant tax event when that seller sells. So the penalty to them, if they take all that equity at closing, is going to be significantly larger. So I like finding sellers who, for example, the ones we did in Tulsa, those 4 deals, she owned all those properties free and clear. And she had 14 properties in her portfolio. So she is the prototypical tired landlord. And had she sold everything she had, she would have had a $1.5 million taxable event, and it would have wiped them out from a tax standpoint. So the idea of converting this problem house that for a tired landlord isn't even producing any cash flow right now because the tenant's not paying you, taking that liability, frankly, and turning it into an asset that produces reliable cash flow, and then being able to say to them, oh, by the way, you're no longer a landlord, you're now a lender. No one's going to call you because the toilet broke or because there's water on the roof or the tiles are coming. You're not going to get any of those calls anymore because you get as many of those calls as Wells Fargo gets, which is to say none. You can now sit on a beach and sip a nice drink and watch the checks come in. And if at any point the checks stop coming in, you can pick up the phone, call your attorney and say, find out what's going on. And if we don't get resolution quickly, go foreclose. And in a month and a half, you'll have your property back. So it is a very easy sell. Now, what's the problem? What's the downside? The downside is I don't do this I can't sell this in New York. I haven't tried. I don't even try to sell this in New York or California because neither New York nor California are fast foreclosed states. So if that seller who doesn't know me, I can't say to them, hey, if I don't perform, you can quickly foreclose and get your property back, because it's not going to be quick. In New York, it can take you up to a year to get your property back through foreclosure. So it's not as easy a pitch in all 50 states. But in the southern states, in the states where it's fast foreclosed, which is to say most of them, it's a very easy pitch. And on top of that, not only do I say, can you get your property back, you can actually make, if I don't perform on this agreement, you're actually going to make more money than if I did perform. You're actually going to be wishing every night that I would default on this loan so you can take the property back, keep my down payment, and take the property and sell it to somebody else a month later. So I can easily pitch this to anxious sellers. And I don't want to throw too much out there, but what I will often do with these deals, and this may be relevant for some of you who've asked me about this, what we've been doing for the last 15 years, is we will find these deals that we can structure with seller financing, like this one. And then we'll buy this property with this eye-popping cash-on-cash return, and we'll do what's called a wrap. And a wraparound mortgage, also known as an all-inclusive deed of trust or all-inclusive trust deed. It is the equivalent, or it is the equivalent to, or the analogous. It's analogous to if you've ever seen a sublease, master lease kind of arrangement where I lease from you and then I turn around and lease to somebody else, except instead of involving leases, it involves mortgages. I buy the deal from you, the seller, and then I turn around and sell it with financing to an end buyer. It's effectively a wholesale transaction because I do the two transactions at the same time simultaneously, but I can take this deal, do a wrap, and offer this attractive financing or some version of this attractive financing to an end investor. And then what happens every month is that investor pays me some amount of money. Let's say they may pay me $13.60, and I keep 100 of that, and I pay $12.60 to the seller. So I stay in the middle. So but I'm not a landlord either. I'm also a lender. And again, I don't want to get too deeply into this. If you have an interest in that, ask about it. And if you're in the skill set group, Facebook skill set group, ask about it because I talk about that quite a bit. But just know that there's tons of creative strategies once you can get these things into your hands. If you can't get them into your hands directly, but if you can be the recipient of these, I buy these deals with financing, and then I turn around and sell these deals with financing to investors. And I was hoping that one of the investors I've done business with in the past could be on the call, but he's on an oil rig someplace. But we've done 4 deals together that were seller financed just exactly like this. So to answer your question, can you find deals, Mitch, for me that involve seller financing? The answer is yes. And we can talk about that later. But anyway, just know that if I haven't done anything other than open your eyes to the possibility that this is a thing, and it's going to be a thing that's going to be done more and more and more as interest rates go up and as the population ages out and wants to find ways to create income streams over time, those of us who understand how this thing works are going to be able to do deals that other people are going to pass over because the numbers don't work for them. They'll see the 2.3% or the negative cash-on-cash return in some cases and go, there's no deal there. Whereas I'm looking at the exact same deal going, I see 20% cash-on-cash all day and all night. Give me that deal. And not only is the seller happier in that situation, but I am way happier. So thank you all for sitting and hearing me rant about seller financing. You can tell that I love what I do. We have done a bunch of deals. I'm happy to talk about deal structure and about joint venturing on deals. I can tell you that the overseas investors that I'm talking to right now are desperately trying to find more deals like this because it is magic for them. And if you're used to paying cash, the idea that you can buy a $300,000 or $290,000 asset with just $20,000 down seems pretty magical to me. So let's continue the conversation about these kinds of deals. If no one has any final questions, I will call it a wrap. Let me stop the share and see your bright shining faces. Anybody got anything for me? Anybody? Oh, we're all, I guess you guys are there. Any questions that I haven't answered? Everybody good?
No, this was good, Mitch. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I do want to respect your time. It is exactly 8 o'clock. So thank you for being here. For those of you who are in the Team Unstoppable community, I'll have this available as a replay sometime in the next 12 hours.